This week on Robot Thought Leaders, we're joined by Ryan Weaver, who's the Director of Automation, Robot Director, Robot Manager, Robot Product Manager, just the robot guy.
Marketing in there.
At Access New England.
He's everything.
Yeah, does it all. We had an amazing conversation. Ryan's very well-spoken, articulated. We shouted out Ed Mullen for his first time showing up at Access New England with a robot back in 2012. We talked about right-hand robotics. We talked about AI. We talked about Sam Bouchard probably a lot with some lean robotics mentality in there.
Sorry, Sam.
Ryan asked us a bunch of really good questions too towards the end, which I thought was a nice change of pace. So check it out.
Yeah, just an awesome conversation going back through the history of UR and Access New England and Ryan's coming of age within robotics, and then where he has seen the market change in the last 5 years and where the cobot market is going as we speak right now, and some new technology he thinks is going to change the game here in the next few years. So please give us a listen. We hope that you enjoy it. Thanks.
Welcome to the Robot Thought Leaders Podcast with Zach Tompkinson and Chris Savoya, bringing you in-depth interviews with industry experts driving change in the robot world.
All right, welcome to Robot Thought Leaders, Ryan. Happy to have you on the show today. We're just gonna kind of go for it. We're just gonna start recording right now and
sounds good
and see what we get. It's gonna be a pretty open conversation. We like to hear about your background first, so we'll kind of ask you all the way back to maybe first robotics or whatever you were doing before you got to WPI, and then at WPI, of course, getting out. How you got started at Axis. We want to hear about UR for the first time too.
Sure.
When you guys first got going.
First opinions when like you got the first one. I'd love to go I want to go all the way back. I want you to
first day.
I want
you want to write a book with me sometime, Zach? I think I think there's a story to tell there.
There's definitely some good stories, but I only come in like halfway through. So I want to hear like the first day you got the UR. What was your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I guess first of all, thanks for having me on here. I'm not a regular podcaster, so you'll have to excuse any of my faux pas. But
it's okay. No worries.
I think that if nothing else, we've seen this format. If the pandemic has given us nothing else, it's given us podcasts aplenty. So I'm glad to see what you guys have started, and I've been able to enjoy a couple of the episodes. So
cool,
good stuff. Yeah. So your question again, Zach?
Yeah.
First day.
So
set the scene for first time you got a UR.
Actually,
you unboxed it.
Backtrack 1 second here. First, I have something I want to say. It's a Tech Tuesday, so we're all having beers on Tech Tuesday, just like we did in college.
Tech Tuesday.
I don't together.
That must have been after my time.
Really? That sounds shocking. You must have just not partaken. But yeah,
just different days.
Old WPI tradition. So yes, but my question was, the first time that you got the cobot would have been like 2014, 2015, I believe.
2012.
You had one in 2012.
Had one in 2012. Yeah. So, and it wasn't a cobot. We didn't even know what the heck to call it. It was a robot that apparently wouldn't hurt you. It was safe to work around people. This was a Gen 2 robot at that point, I think.
CB2.
Yeah, it was a CB2 robot at that point back in 2012, 2014, 15, I think was when the CB3s came around, if I remember right. So, yeah, I remember sitting down to see a demo of the UR5 on a tabletop, and I thought I was this toy, what was this gonna be? This was a joke in terms of, a product. Why would we need a robot that's gentle and easy to program? It's, why wouldn't, if you're going to automate something, why not use these
Better than
powerful,
human.
strong industrial robots? And so,
Were you guys using other 6-axis robots at the time, Yaskawa or others?
yeah, we had a couple of different brands for, Scara robots, your traditional kind of 6-axis, 5-axis robots. Nothing enormous, but I had done my fair share of programming and deploying commissioning applications for some of your more traditional type robots. And so I knew what I was doing with those in terms of the script programming and things like that. So I said, I know how to program these. Why would I need something that's easier? And who's gonna work next to a robot? And so by the time we were done with that demo, I was a believer. I was convinced, because all it took was having that teach pendant in your hand and saying, geez, I could teach this thing to do an entire program in the amount of time I would have to boot up and do the initial settings for a traditional robot.
Yeah.
Who was in the room with you? Were you in the conference room at Access New England in Danvers?
Yeah, that's where we were. Yep.
Who was doing the demo?
Mr. Ed Mullen.
Ed Mullen. Shout out Ed Mullen.
Yes. Yeah. So currently with Mir, but he was the man at that time. He was the only Universal Robots employee in the
How
US.
was his demo? Can we get some positives and negatives on Ed Mullen's demo? 10 years past.
I think it was kind of a throw it on the table, you hit the keys, boom, boom. It's, robot moves.
Moving.
It works, stand in front of it, whatever you want to do.
That's his was like a speed thing.
That's
like
my Ed Mullen impression.
Yeah, the Long Island accent.
Yeah, I'm not good at it, so I won't try too hard. But he ultimately established a pretty extensive channel in the US. So he did.
I would say that he ultimately created the channel strategy for UR that ultimately got adopted globally. I'm sure there are others that were decision makers in that process, but I know he certainly was a game changer in let's talk to distribution and work this through distribution based on his previous experience working in distribution. I'm sure we'd have to get him on the podcast to get his story, because I'm sure he's got some better history behind it. But certainly the father of the distribution channel through UR.
Yeah. And even all the other collaborative robots that have adopted it now too. I mean, if you think about it, cobots in general kind of have a different go-to-market strategy than traditional industrial robots.
It wasn't always there are other robot companies previously that had, adopted a channel strategy. Obviously like Axis, you guys were repping other robot lines at that point too. So it wasn't necessarily that. I think really around the cobot piece was where that fit. Continue. I'm sorry for interrupting, Ryan.
No, I think the big difference in terms of how you figure out where to use these robots compared to those sort of traditional applications is the people who are deploying those are completely different. You've got on one side a automation engineering leader or robotics programmer, what have you, either at an integrator or at a large company who has the staff for that. And then the other side, you have the manufacturing technician or maybe the manufacturing engineer who we were working with on these problems that they have. And so unlike with the traditional robots where you kind of knew once you sized out the application what you were dealing with and you knew what kind of robot they were going to use. Well, with the UR, it was not only necessary because the folks who are going to be deploying these robots weren't typically used to doing that. And so they needed a better sense of how things worked, but you could take the robot all of a sudden and put it right on the factory floor and have it do the job before anybody ever, had to sign a PO to get the process going. You could just do the job right on the floor. And so not only from a technology standpoint was that transformative, but from a solving the application standpoint, that was huge. The ability just to show up and make it work.
Yep.
That's it's interesting to think back to that time frame and kind of where the mindset was in the industry too, and see how much. I mean, obviously, it took a long time too, because that you said that was 2012. So when did you sign on as officially as a distributor? I believe that was that
Early 2013. Yeah. And interestingly enough, Sam Bouchard, who I know you had on this podcast a few episodes back, he had showed up on our doorstep no more than 6 months prior to Ed. And so at the time we were looking at this, really cool, flexible gripper, but without any clear sense of what are we going to use this for? How many traditional robot applications are going to use this flexible gripper? And he mostly had the 3-finger gripper at the time, and then eventually came out with the 2-finger gripper that they're so famous for today, for all those SolidWorks splash screens and of course the cobot industry in general. But so, it was sort of a marriage made in heaven. And I remember when we went down to, it was actually Annapolis, Maryland, both one of our engineers and myself traveled down there for the first training, where one of the UR guys who'd been on a epic world tour, Stefan, if you remember,
Stefan Stubgard, another shout out.
He's still around.
Yeah, I think he got back from Brazil, maybe a few hours before starting with us. This group of people who knew nothing about this robot in Maryland in some hotel. So
crazy.
That's where things got kicked off.
Yeah, Sam told a really good story about the high tech distributor conference, just basically being in the backyard in Quebec City, and he just happened to go, and find a lot of people that were interested in his stuff, and that kind of led to a lot of the success that they had inadvertently. So it's pretty cool.
Flipping us around here, because you should be the focal point on the bottom. I don't know. I had it there before, but now you're back. So
okay. Everything's the same from my perspective,
good.
But
well,
your perspective is the one that matters.
It won't be on the main screen. So when you see this flip happen, when you rewatch it, you'll see it happen.
There you go.
Time.
So Ryan, I wanted to ask you a question. This actually came up in my life recently. Some of my friends, some of my family here that we got a podcast, they're like wanting to listen to it. And, Aunt Betty is like sitting around the table with you, and she knows not a thing about robots. She thinks that I might as well be like, making rockets or like something crazy, So when you want to talk about like what you want to do or what you do for a living with robots, what do you think is the most misunderstood thing that you have to deal with when you're talking to just like some average, Joe, something like that?
Well, I think there's two things, and I'll frame both of them. I think one specific to what I do, what Axis does, what folks in our space, we're talking about this distribution channel. If you don't know what that is, if you're Aunt Betty, it's confusing. What are we even talking about here? And I think one thing that, if you're in college right now and you're studying engineering or robotics or what have you, there's the thing that's tough to always keep in mind is that kind of the commercial pathway for these products. Everything that is designed and engineered has to somehow get out to the end user. And Amazon's not the pathway for everything out there, right? Yeah. So, it's what we do. Ultimately, the way I describe it is that we work with manufacturers like Universal Robots who make an excellent product, but haven't necessarily the means to figure out how to use it in the real environments at the local level where manufacturers are trying to apply these technologies. And so our job is to be the automation expert, not only in the product and the technology and how to apply it, but also in our customers' processes. So we bridge that gap between understanding what manufacturers in New England, across the nation, across the globe are doing, and what the technology is capable of, so that we can help guide them through that process and, ultimately sell them the technology or the solution that's going to do that job for them. So that's why we exist. And it's a confusing thing to think that you don't just go to the robot store and buy a robot, because you're going to have a real bad time. But that's
the solution, or the boots on the ground. You're the people who kind of put the pieces together in the way that they need to be.
And
So
I would
that's
say,
what
and
you
have
that's
practical
what you'd
know-how.
explain as distribution to Aunt Betty. What's the other half?
So the other half is what robots actually do, right? I think the thing that we not only deal with this with Aunt Betty, but with the manufacturers that we work with, which is, I think, the media and movies and TV shows do a lot to build up our expectations about what technology and robotics and these kinds of things, even AI, are capable of. Like, they're just these magic things that you just plop it into place and it's going to do a job for you. Or you've got, like the Jetsons, a robot walking around your house, helping you out with tasks.
Talking,
People are trying to do that, but the dots to connect to get there are tremendously far from what the kind of magic utopia that we sometimes see from a media perspective. So it's, I try to generally explain, what a robot is good at doing, and it's good at doing what you tell it to do. If you tell it to, just go from point A to point B, it's going to keep doing that better than a person could, but it's going to have no sense. And so then you got to bring sensing into it. You bring sensors or cameras or what have you into the picture. And so you start building up this solution. And so that's, to me, where the future of a lot of this is going to go, is not only making that programming easier, like we talked about at the very beginning, which is, how magical it was to get this teach pendant in my hands that I could, in a matter of a few minutes, teach a robot to do something really powerful, like move something from here to there. But where things are going, I think, is adding some of that additional sensing in that adds intelligence to the robot, while we're making that programming easier, so that the robot is more capable, more like a person. Because that's the analog people have in their head, is they see robots and they think things like, Terminator or Wall-E or what have you, depending on your age level. And, the robots just don't naturally, the industrial robots don't have that kind of perception just baked right in to see and hear and think like people do, obviously. And so it's understanding limitations on what a robot can do versus what a person could be expected to do.
Yeah, totally. I mean, we were talking to Sven last time from Artie Minds. He's like a next level robot guy, right? He just has eat and breathed and slept and dreamt about robots, for years and years. And it was interesting. He was talking about AI. I think AI is one of those things that the closer you get to AI and the closer you get to understanding what AI is, the less you realize, or the more you realize it's really not a big thing. It's not as powerful as people make it out to be. Like, we're not necessarily a Terminator status yet, but he was talking about how there's not nearly enough data on the robots to run like really good AI yet. And I always thought that was interesting. I thought there was a ton of data around robots, and he's like, no, in order to be able to do truly more generalized, unstructured AI, you need vast amounts of data, vastly more than what is available on any robot platform right now. And even with the sensors that we have, it may not be enough. We need to find more data to be able to run it.
And then the other problem with that too is you've got so many different brands of robot or AI doing those calculations rather than doing it all together. So there is no like central area for everything to be dumped into, which means that everyone's collecting their own data rather than sharing it, meaning it's going to take even longer. And until there's more of a clear winner there, it's who knows how long it will really be.
Yeah.
I think the great challenge with AI, and I apologize for moving over to the side here for those who can see the video feed. I'm trying to dodge the sun as it sets outside here. But I think the great challenge with AI is, as we see it starting to make its way into control platforms for motion control, for example, to solve common tasks like a flying knife application or a wind unwind application, even for just cases where you're dealing with 2 or 3 axes of motion, not even a robot. The big challenge is that, as anybody who's familiar with AI or neural networks would know, you don't often know why or exactly how the AI has come up with the result that it has, or the pathway to the solution that it has. And so you don't really know exactly how it's going to behave, even though it's ultimately going to achieve the end task. It's not necessarily
Predictable.
You can't look inside the brain and say, oh, I see exactly how this is working, especially when it gets extremely complex. It would take a person a really long time to understand exactly how that program was built. And it's not going to build it like a person would. So when it comes to manufacturing tasks, people want that stuff to be really well understood, well vetted, repeatable, easy to troubleshoot. Even if it gets to the end result quicker, it's got to be predictable. And I think that scares a lot of people in manufacturing, not to mention the working around people and even, medical applications where, we need to make sure that the processes are well understood in terms of the programming, things like that. So there's a lot of hurdles to cross on the AI front in manufacturing.
It begs a very interesting question. Is there a very different level of standard or expectation for human versus robot? Because humans make decisions all the time that are not necessarily understood. So is it acceptable to say that like machinery forever will be judged on a completely different scorecard?
Well, I guess the difference is that the human can explain to you their thought process, right?
Sure.
And maybe there are, AI engines that can do that today, but I'm not aware of them. And I certainly don't think that they're being applied more broadly in manufacturing.
And even if they get to that point, they might be able to give you some sort of, okay, well, it checked these 4 boxes or it hit these different thresholds, but it's not going to say, it likely won't be able to tell you every single step of the way why it made the decision it did. Someone could look it up, I'm sure, that knows it, but for the everyday user, it's going to be very difficult to see that.
There are a lot of practical cases where we are seeing AI being applied, particularly in machine vision. I think that's one clear area where, what these neural networks are able to do, just like the CAPTCHAs that you see on the web where, for Aunt Betty, maybe who isn't aware, when you click the 3 bridges, what you're probably helping somebody do is, you're giving them 2 that they already knew and 1 that they didn't know for sure was a bridge. And that's feeding some self-driving car, AI algorithm somewhere that's being developed. So there's a lot that's going on like that in the industrial automation space where
Darryl brought that up
literally
the last
guy we talked to
awesome.
Said the same exact thing about CAPTCHAs.
Well, clearly I haven't listened to the most recent episode of the podcast.
Okay. It hasn't been released yet, so you're
okay.
good.
Well, there's my my pass, I guess.
Call me a bit crazy, but I have taken to willfully trying to mess up the CAPTCHAs. And I don't do so deceitfully in that I like actively choose the wrong answer. I just now try and choose the answer so quickly that there's no way I could possibly process what's in the images.
And does it work?
I just click them as fast as I can, and half the time they're letting me through. So,
oh yeah, most of the time they let you through. I'm like, when I saw a thing earlier and it was like, are you stressing when it's like, here's a stoplight? It's like select the stoplights, and it's just a little bit in like the top of it goes into the next block. It's like, do you select that one or not? And like the stress that comes with it. Yeah, I relish in those moments.
Well, it's not that different from what we're seeing our customers do is they've got, packages or product or whatever that a person is really good at looking at this product and saying, oh, there's a little scratch over here. These subjective decisions, right? Of this product is too damaged to go on, or it's, just falls under the threshold in terms of, quality control, things like that. And so, what we're seeing applications for AI is feeding a computer just, tens, hundreds, thousands of these images of what good and bad product are. Yeah. It's going to say, we think that these are the good ones and the bad ones, and you can then correct it just like that CAPTCHA and start to build that knowledge base. And the more that it goes through the process, the more that it learns. And so I'm excited to see that gap start to get bridged in robotics as well, in manipulation tasks, in kind of live dynamic tasks, as opposed to just the quality control type applications, which are, I think there's a lot of exciting opportunity there too. But in the kind of what I would consider live action decision making,
You look at like what like right hand robotics has been able to do, and certainly shout out to Yarrow and Leif and the guys over at Right Hand. And it's very interesting to see the way that, because that's ultimately what they're trying to do, right? Is have a neural network built around being able to pick something and make a better decision the next time around when it goes to pick that same object or something similar to it.
Yeah. So it's taking, there are the brute force ways of doing it where you could, just try to do a task of, millions of times and document the ones that work properly. And then, tell the system, hey, do more of this and repeat the process. But I think that there's a middle ground somewhere there where these AI systems, these neural networks feed information into human-driven algorithms that are programs that have been, a person has taught and made decisions on. So it's the combination of the two that I think is where we're going to start to see those. Yeah. First applications.
Yeah. Cool. Maybe you could talk about Right Hand a little bit. I don't know, Ryan, were you involved with Right Hand when they kind of got like up and running? I know they're a pretty big, customer of Access New England and Universal Robots as well. And their technology has really matured, but were you there in the beginning when they were just get up and running? Did you put some of that legwork in?
Well, Leif and Yarrow might, I don't remember what paperwork I might have signed back at the Harvard Biorobotics Lab. No, I'm joking, but I do remember certainly some of the work that they were doing at an early stage. I took a trip up to Harvard to visit those guys and see some of the work that they were doing. They had a Baxter arm in their lab at the time. For those of us who vividly remember that.
Well, I guess they're not completely. They do have a new
Baxter. Sawyer is still around. Baxter's pretty much.
Is there a Baxter still at all?
I think they sold portion of it. So they sold the Baxter piece to a company out of China or the government of China, something out of China. And to fulfill a bunch of orders that they had already had the robot doing similar applications. And then the Sawyer arm was sold to Germany. Just drawing a blank on a large integrator out of Germany.
Han Group,
yes. And they have continued the development, and I believe they are still selling the product. Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah. So
black now.
Side, but...
Yeah.
It's black now. It's no longer red.
Yeah. So that's kind of your classic example of we're going to try to pick something up 10,000 times and see how it does, and continue to tell it to do more like the good times and less like the bad ones. So,
and if I remember correctly, they had a patent on their manipulator, which was also kind of their secret sauce at the time, and they kind of peppered the AI on top to give it.
Was it always AI, or was it always at the beginning AI, or was it more manipulation right at the beginning and designing the perfect end effector, and then they came to AI later?
I believe that was the starting point, but they would be certainly a better.
Well, we're gonna have to get them on here and ask.
Better source for that information than I would.
Ryan's playing quiet. I understand. So, could you tell us about how you got started in robots? Did you do anything like FIRST Robotics or something like that when you were in high school? And what led you to want to pursue this career?
Yeah, it's a good question. Certainly, it was not a linear pathway for me. I wasn't. WPI actually had the year I graduated was the first graduating class of the robotics program. So you can probably figure out how old I am if you want to do all the homework there. But yeah, that was the first robotics. I wasn't part of that class. I studied mechanical engineering, but I think for me, actually, from a career standpoint, for a while, I had intended to go into teaching. I had done a lot of the program in school with the thought of teaching. And interestingly, I think one of the reasons why I went to work at Axis was that I think one of my colleagues that you both know, Nathan DeRochers, recently made this analogy to me that I think resonates, which is that being in our space, working hands-on with customers in kind of a sales application solving environment really is like teaching in a way, right? It's helping people who maybe don't understand the technology or the solution as well as we do, and what the right, what a good application is for this technology versus a bad application, and how are they going to be successful, and let's help kind of coach them through this process. It really is kind of like teaching these manufacturers what the right direction to go is. And certainly, a book like Lean Robotics by Sam, is a great example of that, where we're helping to educate that customer through the process of how to get started in robotics and so on. So I think that's what drove me into this pathway.
I was going to say the same thing before you even commented on what Nathan had brought up. I was going to say that, I think you teach people all the time. I certainly have learned a lot from you through the years. You've taught me a lot. You've taught a lot of our customers and a lot of the guys that have either worked with or for me. You have also coached. So, I see that there's a lot of teaching. So it makes sense that was something that you had always wanted to do. And I think you get to fulfill that previous want or, future
Parallel universe.
Now.
Where
Yeah,
Ryan's
exactly.
a professor or even a high school teacher for physics or something. Who knows? But
I did it though. Yeah, I went through the whole practicum process and taught in a 8th grade high school classroom, which was interesting. It smells about as good as you remember, probably. But
that makes a ton of sense, because I think that's reflected in what I've seen you guys put on for training, not just at Axis like sit down training, but the seminars. And I'm not blowing smoke here for anybody who's listening to us. If you want to probably have one of the better like robot one-day experiences, you'd go to an Axis New England seminar, because I have a ton of fun at them every time I go, even if I'm just sitting in the back and watching. I've never heard someone walk out of those and say that they weren't blown away. They didn't learn more than they ever thought they were gonna. By the time it's all done, they probably had a couple beers, so they're smiling ear to ear, but they're well fed, watered, fed, and full of knowledge. So
I always say that I think I've worked with 40 or 45 different distributors, and it's the best one. Sorry for anybody that thinks that theirs is better. But it's just, there are some other really, really good ones as well, not to name any more names, but, anyone that thinks that theirs is on par, they should come and check out the half-day seminar that Axis puts on. Hopefully they'll get back to that post-COVID, because they are truly one of a kind, and you walk away with knowing how to program a robot and being able to apply it, whether you're a engineer, operator, or plant manager, or doesn't matter, in about 4 hours.
And that's just it. It's a microcosm for the same dynamics you would have in a manufacturing floor, where you have, the big boss who never touches anything. You got his right-hand man who's always the guy on the sticks, like controlling everything. You get a couple other guys hanging around, and disrupting that dynamic is also a huge part of the fun at the seminars.
Definitely. It's almost like you can treat it as like a team building conference. Part of the time.
Yeah, we should start marketing it that way instead. The robots are just secondary. It's purely a team building exercise.
That's good.
Yeah, certainly among thank you for the kind words, but I think, among the things that I miss, certainly in a professional context, that have been hard during COVID, certainly family and these kinds of things make a bigger impact probably. But if I'm making my list of professional things that I miss the most, having the ability to do, it's been throughout this pandemic process, it's been being able to run these seminar events, which I think, to your point, Chris, it's just so fun to see some of these folks come in who've never touched a robot, or maybe they're like I was back in 2012, where I was a skeptic and didn't necessarily think that this was
With
all
Ed Mullen
that,
in the room.
and
Yeah.
how quickly I was, how my mind was changed. But it's sort of the power of the democratization of automation. That's what I feel like we're seeing in a nutshell there, is people being able to walk up to the robot as a tool that they're going to use to solve a problem. And we've tried to lay the challenges out for them, and they learn by doing, right? I mean, I think if we go back to if I'm going to compliment WPI on anything, it's, from our experiences, you probably have the same sense, but the focus on practical, hands-on, project-based learning
the best.
It's super important, right? It's super important to get, especially these younger people who maybe haven't had some of those hands-on experiences. They've only learned physics and math in a classroom, and they haven't done a lot of stuff with their hands. Getting in there, machining parts, teaching a robot how to do a job, using programming in a real practical setting. That's kind of like what I relate what we do in that environment to. And so it's just a lot of fun.
Like that versus, say, filling out an equation. I saw a very good photo the other day, and it was like my mathematics skills over time as an engineer, as a degreed engineer. And it was like, algebra, pre-calc, calculus, differential equations, fluid dynamics, and then like showing all the different like equations that you would have done. And then it's like post-career, and then it's Excel, right? And it's like, that, and honestly, I mean, like, I know that there are a lot of engineers out there that do a lot more with their, from an engineering standpoint than what we all may do. But from a practical standpoint, all the things that I did at WPI, not book worthy, but say building a respiratory monitor for a, SIDS baby device or something like that, where I actually had to tie together all sorts of mechatronics, and especially from a programming side, it made me get involved in so many different areas of engineering to put together this device, consult with the electronics, the robotics, different professors, just to help me be able to put it together. I mean, you can't, that's how the real world works when you're out in the job force of working on a team doing a project. And so most schools don't go through something like that. And I think that is why you see a lot of people come from WPI and they're in high demand and they do well in the workforce, is because they're already predisposed and they've seen all those things from college.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's not to knock the academic world, which is, rooted in, to your point, it's driving deeper in a narrower space typically. And I think there's a lot of incredible things that researchers and, PhD level academics deliver to the world, and certainly to companies as well. But I think there's a lot to be said about just getting out there and doing it. And, I'm really excited because once a lot of the, the things start to settle down, as we hopefully get into the summer and into the fall, we are working with some local schools to donate a number of robots
Awesome.
to some of those local high schools, really. And so I hope that we can give them a tool that they can use when it comes to getting that hands-on practical experience, similar to what they're actually going to experience in the real world. So
yeah, that's awesome, man.
Are those schools already selected? Do they know about it? Is there a raffle that is going to occur that we should be promoting here?
Nothing I think I can promote. I think we've got the schools all selected. Some are aware, some are partly aware. It's unfortunately, like many things, COVID came in and crashed our party, our plans there. Yeah. But certainly when the time is right, we're going to be reaching out to those schools, and we'll be sharing hopefully some of their initial experiences. And there are high schools today right now that are using universal robots in their curriculum. because of the fact that it's this accessible tool that even kids, I remember, boy, it brings me back quite a bit, but my younger brother did a programming. I think I had the robot with me one weekend and just set it up, brought the robot in, showed him how it worked. And he did a little programming application to take a cup of water and fill it off of a water cooler and just something simple like that. But how much I think he learned and inspired his career path and trajectory where he wanted to be based on even just that one experience of, wow, I can really make a robot do some really cool stuff. And I want to push that further. So hopefully we can inspire some young folks from different backgrounds across New England to get that first experience.
It's pretty cool when you see that light in people's eyes, that click where it's just like they finally get it. And what you were talking about at seminars earlier, I think a lot of people walk out of there with their first real understanding of like what robots actually do. You were talking about it, and that click is pretty awesome to see. And when it clicks and they can see how they can use this thing in different places, it's something you rarely ever forget. So it's awesome.
It's not just for kids,
for your brother.
It's for the machinist who is in his maybe early 60s, who's been working with some newer older technology things the way that they've been done for a long time, and gets behind the sticks. And it's funny, I remember visiting a manufacturer years ago, and I'll share this analogy, or the story anyway, that he told, which was that when it comes to fear of new technologies, fear of automation in particular, it's what he said is that the reason why he's still doing what he's doing, he's a machinist, works with current modern day CNC machines. He watched technology come through from years ago. So it was initially all this work was being done by hand. And so he had
bridge ports. Yeah. Like completely nothing computer controlled.
Well, even before, prior to bridge ports was his experience, and then started working with bridge ports, and people would say, I don't want to work with that. I want to do this stuff manually because, that thing's it's going to take my job. The bridge port's going to take my job.
Yeah.
And he said, well, the reason why I'm still here today is because I dug into the bridge port and I wanted to learn how that thing could make my job easier and elevate my job. And then when the CNC machines came around, the programmable CNCs, I learned how those work. And the guys who said, oh, that thing's going to take my job, I don't want anything to do with that, let's get rid of it. Those guys found something else to do and no longer were in that career space. And their jobs were lost to automation because they let them, they didn't raise their game. And so he picked up the teach pen into the robot and very quickly got involved in programming the robot to do a job, and said, I want to learn how this works because I want to once again elevate my career and automation proof myself, because I'm going to know how the technology that everybody else is afraid is going to steal their jobs. I want to be figuring out how to make that thing work and do my job better than I could do it today. So it's certainly a forward
Was this guy
thinking.
at a seminar as well?
Say again?
Was that guy at a seminar as well?
He might have come at one point, customer? But yeah, I know this was, we were doing a task on site right in front of their machine. And so he was programming,
cool.
Real live application that they had.
If you had to say something to people who don't see nearly as many customers as you get to see, and I think it's pretty unique, as you were saying earlier, part of the role of the distributor is to be that connector between the equipment manufacturers and the manufacturers out in the field who are using the equipment. So if you had to kind of reiterate one thing to those people, whether it's, you are R&D or some other company, maybe it's a startup, they haven't really gotten out and seen that many customers yet, what would you tell them about the way that real customers think?
I guess in general, I would just emphasize that user experience is kind of everything at a point when it comes to particularly getting someone's buy-in that this technology is worth working with, worth investing in, worth learning deeper. And so it's kind of that first 15-minute, 30-minute hook of, do you believe that this is going to work, or did you get stuck on something? Is something not working the way that you expected it to work? Is it not naturally intuitive? And so I would encourage, certainly you are, and all automation manufacturers, to think about that. Think about who's deploying your product today and who might be doing it tomorrow. Because to the point of democratizing automation, I think, the entry points are getting lower. People are seeing the need to automate, and not every company can afford to have, multiple automation engineers on staff. They might not have any engineers on staff.
Yeah.
But that doesn't change their need to automate. And so, the more accessible we make these things, not simpler, just more accessible. And I think that UR has done a pretty good job of figuring out how to crack that nut in terms of making things powerful, yet still accessible to people.
Yeah.
Now, flip that question around from a manufacturer standpoint. From a local manufacturer that you would sell to. What advice would you give them when looking at automation and robotics, with all of the knowledge that you have, considering the fact that you guys have deployed over 1,000 robots, about 1,000 URs are almost there. It's going to be an awesome celebration.
I'm invited.
And there's obviously a lot of skill that you have from seeing probably 500 plus or 1,000 plus manufacturing floors from just a robotic automation standpoint. What is your advice to a customer that is never automated before?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I think it is a good question. And I think that the classic mistake that I think I see time and time again, and I'll compare that to the folks who don't capitalize on the opportunity versus the people who really take the ball and run with it. I think the thing that differentiates them, is the difference between looking at starting with something like a UR automation that they can do themselves, flexible automation, looking at that like a traditional capital expenditure, looking at that like buying a piece of machinery that's going to do a very specific task. It's not that black and white in terms of the return on investment. The companies that have the greatest success are the ones who say, yeah, we're going to calculate how much this is going to pay us back for this particular application, but we're also going to value even greater what we're going to learn, what our people are going to learn, what eye-opening experiences we're going to have by bringing this in and trying this out for ourselves. And I think we can all relate to that experience of buying something new that's supposed to do something for us. And then once you're a little ways in, you've got a much better understanding of that technology, that hobby, that, car, whatever thing that you're delving into. It, once you've spent time with it, you know now what you didn't know before, and you can't know, you can't try to cross off all those unknowns on the front end.
Yeah.
So those who, I don't want to say that they throw caution to the wind, but they certainly value the learning experience and the opportunity to kind of raise the bar for themselves, because they see what's coming. And automation is not a trend. It's not something that is going to slow down. I think that when we look at global competitiveness, it's an integral piece to these companies it's not a question of whether automation's happening in your industry. Automation is happening. It's a question of, are you among the early adopters somewhere in the middle, or are you going to be
Are you going to be left behind?
Yeah, either left behind or trying to play catch up. And playing catch up is not the position you want to be in, because those folks who started at the beginning have learned, to my point before, so much that they could never have known until they did it for themselves. And so, I think those folks who, and many of them have chosen to automate since then, but I think of how, if I look at a manufacturer 4 years ago, or 5 years ago, we actually had a customer recently deploy their first robot who I think 5 or 6 years ago, looked at the first application together. And
Longest
Long
sales cycle.
Jinx.
Record.
and so, but I just think of where could they have been if they had pulled the trigger 5 years ago instead of waiting 5 years. They could have a half dozen or a dozen robots automating applications, or maybe other automation technology that they they learned better, right?
Yeah.
It's in part, you're communicating to your customers, your employees, your management, that this is, you are forward thinking here, and you're trying to solve the problems, hopefully not just of today, but also of the future, by investing in this knowledge that you're going to have. So that's, to me, is the real.
The LOI. I remember that from the early Robotique pitch deck.
Mm-hmm.
The learning on investment often needs to be heavily considered to be more important than an ROI.
It's definitely
not to say ROI doesn't exist or shouldn't be considered, because it should, but the LOI, you kind of have to look 5 years out, and where do you want to be as a company on that specific floor, and then work backwards and go, well, if we limit everything by ROI, we might not even be around in 5 years. And the first ROI is usually the worst. Let's be honest. It's rare that the other second, third, fourth, and fifth ones end up being worse. The first one's always the hardest. So,
but interestingly, I feel like the cases where people are going for that highest ROI application, or are kind of doing the ROI calculation to death, those are the ones that we see the least successful, because they've picked the wrong application. They've picked what's going to maybe be the greatest bang for their buck if they get it perfect. But this goes back to, you can't know what you don't know today. You're going to find that out on the pathway there. And so if part of the goal is to do it yourself, you got to calculate that into where you start as well. So I really think that's the biggest, that's the secret sauce.
It's like pain point versus the return on investment versus the ease of being able to do it. And I think that, like, sometimes those people simplify those to two things. But I do think that there really is three. It's like, what is the ROI high, or is the ROI low, versus is the, pain going to be super high or low? And then, how easy is it truly to get this done? And when you look at like an LOI, so many applications that we go through that you would learn to be able to do those harder applications that might even have a better ROI if you had learned first, versus trying to tackle it. And then some people will bite it off. They'll take on the hardest one that they perceive on paper as the best payback period, but it is super hard, and it was their biggest pain point. And then they go, well, that was horrible. I had a horrible experience. And it was like, well, you instead of trying to
listen,
play the game at the beginner level, you decided to go on to play against the computer at the extremely difficult, the hardest level.
Expert.
And like, I wouldn't want to play that video game anymore either if I came in and just got destroyed.
Ryan, do you remember at that customer that you were talking about that it was 5 years from when you first went in to when they finally bought their first robot? You remember what like had changed? Was there a changeover like in upper management, or did they have some new engineer that was willing to pick it up, or like what was different about it? You know?
Yeah, I think from from what I remember, I think some management opinions had changed. I think that the thing that I've seen the biggest shift in the last 5 years or so has been a an awareness of the pressure of automation, the need to get on board. I think that uh, owners, managers, operations folks are understanding the just where things are going, but they're also becoming more aware of these technologies that are out there to them that, like cobots, which, like I said, 6, 7 years ago wasn't a term we even used. So I think that we're starting to see the maturation of some of those flexible automation tools that are getting into the spheres, and just enough times you see other people automating, maybe a competitor or a friend of yours who's at a different manufacturing facility. So that kind of a scenario where just I think awareness of the urgency of it finally kind of caught up, and so they made that investment. But
That if I had to maybe guess what you were going to say, I would have said that there was some change in management mentality or changeover in management, because I've seen often where there's a engineer who who has the foresight and sees the benefits of the technology, and then they have to go to management, and management says, "Give me the ROI."
Yeah.
And that's exactly where it usually starts to die.
I think the only other thing I'll just add before we switch topics is, and I guess another shout out to Sam. Boy, I feel like we're just pitching lean robotics really hard on this.
Well, we
podcast.
talk about lean
People
robotics.
who don't know
almost
lean
every
robotics don't know
podcast.
we're talking about it though. So I think we're okay.
Yeah, there you go. So this concept of the minimum viable robotic cell, I don't know if that's exactly the term, but it's don't aim for the moon. Don't put your wish list too high. And actually, one of our successful customers had shared this at last year's, or well, boy, it was 2 years ago now, Robotique conference. This idea of if I could do it again, if I could deploy my first robot again, I would aim in the middle to medium low on difficulty, as opposed to on high. In term, I wouldn't make my wish list of what this robot could do so big. I would get to the finish faster. And it kind of goes back to, I'm last weekend I'm out here working on my 100-year-old New England home, and sometimes the mentality that I have to have is better, not best, right? So let's shoot for making this better. Let's not try to hit perfection, because perfection, it's that exponential growth curve in terms of how much more challenging it is to get that last 90% or last 10% done versus that first 90%. So if the windows are a little crooked, you live with it, and you make it work around it. You don't rip everything out and start.
Never going to be plumb, square, and flush all at the same time.
Exactly. Yeah. So I kind of look at that analogy in the automation, in manufacturing, really is let's get it doing something. Let's get a robot in, let's get it returning, some value to you, and you're going to learn by doing that. Let's not, try to over plan on the front end.
I think it has made the collaborative robot market and the UR market successful was that minimum viable mindset. Maybe it was from a price tag standpoint or just from an ease of entry versus a full turnkey, all the bells and whistles industrial system that isn't going to fail. It's going to have 100% uptime, and you're never going to have to touch it again for the next 3 years. Obviously costs a lot more. And I think that it takes, the other aspect is it just takes a lot longer to design, and you're locked in you're locked in. There's no doubt about it. Like you're not moving, you're not switching things around. It's not flexible. And so I think that is an area, the minimum viable product robot system that the lean robotics book defines and Sam really talks about quite a bit. It's super important to the success so far and to the success in the future. Now, I have a question around that for you. When you look back 5 years or 8 years, let's go 5 years. Look back 5 years, there was a lot of success in, say, even like 2016, 2017, after a few years of having the product. Where do you see now, like what do you see now versus then that is drastically different from a customer standpoint?
Well, I think the most obvious thing to me is that we're getting to a place where I think if I made a list of what manufacturers were most likely to jump into the pool early or automate with robots and least likely to automate with robots, whether it was because of the industry they're in or the type of application that they were looking to solve, I think we're now starting to see many more of those folks at the lower end, the last to jump in the pool on my list, that are really starting to look hard at using robots. And I think there's two things. One is that it's just the typical adoption curve in terms of how we're starting to get more and more people who have used these robots. And so people are seeing it places. It's becoming more well understood. But we're also seeing in the UR Plus ecosystem. And if you're not familiar with that term, it's kind of this plug and play world of products that work with universal robots. And so that world has grown dramatically. A little plug for Chris there. Sorry for, don't mean to do your job.
Our website, if you all want to go check it out, it's looking pretty good.
Yes. So I think that, we're seeing things like sanding tools and screwdriving kits and palletizers and all of which you could do before, deburring solutions, things that I'm not even naming.
Sure.
And those are the kind of, I would call them process intensive applications where we wouldn't touch those with a 10-foot pole 5 years ago because that was the ROI gold standard. We were going to get great payback if we could do it.
On my training chart, it was always like the top of the area, like maybe you try it 5 after you've deployed 5.
Yeah.
Really juicy. And I think for management, those applications always looked really great. But when push came to shove, our customers weren't capable of doing that themselves. And so
that's cool.
We're now at this inflection point, I think, where awareness has grown for the kind of industries that, like the food and bev industry, folks who are in baked goods, for example, who never automated something themselves before. They only maybe have just bought machinery that's going to work. Those people are now saying, well, if I buy this robot with this palletizing solution, it's kind of the whole thing's there. I've got the whole thing ready to go. Or maybe someone who is sanding countertops for a specialty industry, or grinding some material for a surface, a certain surface finish requirement, whatever.
Yeah.
Those people didn't have a tool that we could easily hand to them and say, yes, you can do this yourself. And now we have that, and those people are now way more aware of what robotics can do for them. So that's the big change in my mind.
That's cool. I appreciate
it's all the things that go around the robot that enhance the capabilities.
It was definitely, I haven't thought about it like that, but I think you're 100% correct. One plug for just a really cool anecdote, I think, out of that is I love we have a couple cleaning devices on UR Plus, and it's just something a lot of people would never think of, but it happens a lot. You need to take the fingerprints off a part before you ship it to a you know, one of the supplier has to take the fingerprints off like a machine piece or something like that. They have a person there standing there with like a CO2 gun or a plasma gun, just going over it all day. We have a couple of those options on UR Plus now. So I always think that's a cool one, even if it
Yet to
maybe
see that
isn't
one in the
popular.
application category on the POS reports, but I'm excited to see it when I do.
Yeah, exactly.
I think, well, some of these, this is the way it goes, right? I think some of these things are going to flourish in ways that nobody expected, even the people who maybe designed the tool, and others are going to maybe not be as successful, but that's kind of the reality of these ecosystems. But it's unique, and I think it's oftentimes undervalued by a customer who's looking at what they think is an apples to apples comparison in terms of robot arms. Let's be honest, look very similar across different manufacturers. They're different colors, they've got different shapes, but ultimately they look like they're the same kind of thing.
Sure.
And I think that in itself is an oversimplification. The software tools and all of these things are really important.
Oh, yeah.
But even if we don't look at anything else, and we treat everything else as an apples to apples comparison, having the ability to have a solution that's built for what you're trying to do, that has that plug and play capability, that is just such a transformative thing for a manufacturer who doesn't have that experience, who wants to do it for themselves. And that's why I wouldn't recommend a lot of those applications in the past, because people would just trip up on them. And today they can be successful by themselves, which is pretty impressive.
And it really does seem like that's where things have headed in the past, probably 12 to 18 months, making everything application specific, not necessarily like products, but like you could call them a kit, but trying to get close to a solution without it being customized for each application, each specific application. And so I think it's really interesting to see all the applications that you've brought up. You toss in welding, and you've got all these application kits out there now that someone can take, and it might not solve their exact problem because they might have to tweak it a little bit, but it will get them a lot further than just a robot and some programming got them. Really 5 years ago, those were not around. So
Ryan, I have to say you're an absolute trooper for taking that sunshine right in the eyeballs and not
right
even
in the
blinking.
face.
Right.
Got it. Just a little window that I'm looking through here.
Yeah. I do have to say there's work to be done on those app kits though. I mean, and in general with the whole solution oriented, I think customers still need to see more of it. There's a certain level, just kind of like you go through any adoption curve, early adopters are jumping in on it, but to get the majority in, they just need more and more and more and more all the time. So that's where a lot of the legwork is still like yet to be done.
Well, it has to work. I mean, if it's not easily modified to fit the application after you get the kit, then there's a problem there too. Right? It has to be able to be adjustable enough to fulfill the customized need for the part being a little bit thinner or bigger or different shape than what was the initial design. So it is really interesting. But on top of that, Ryan, I'm curious, outside of, say, obviously collaborative robots have really dominated our lives the past 5 years as an emerging technology, more than 5 years for you. What new technology do you see out there? It may relate to collaborative robots, might be something outside of that, but on the manufacturing floor, what new technology do you see changing manufacturing lives here in the next 3 to 5 years?
I think there's a number of them. I think I hate to go back to the AI topic, but that certainly is one of them that I see that we've barely scratched the surface of, particularly when it comes to inspection and delivering knowledge of, or maybe even I would say coming close to the kind of analysis that a person can do, the subjective determination of whether something is an apple or an orange. Systems can do that really well today in the way that a person can do that we couldn't do in a reliable manufacturing environment 5 years ago. And so that to me is we're just barely scratching the surface of the use of AI, not only in those machine vision applications, but in those programming applications as well.
Yeah.
I think that mobile robots is another one that I have to go to, because it's a technology that predated in some ways collaborative robots in its iteration, and yet has, I think we haven't seen the rabid adoption by customers in the same way, because we've got a similar problem, which is the platform itself is really capable for a lot of these autonomous mobile robots, but what goes on top of those is the equivalent of your application kit. And so there's definitely, we're not at a parallel level in terms of the ecosystem that surrounds these mobile robots and enhances their capabilities and makes them more specific to the application that the customer could use. That makes the customer say, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Let's get one of these and see what it can do for us. But in part, that's I think also due to where the technology returns value for you. They return value in a fleet kind of an environment where you've got lots of these mobile robots doing a task. Whereas, a collaborative robot, you could have one robot that's doing an automated job and returning some real.
Solve it with one, versus in a lot of cases, you need to have a full fleet to get that investment, like payback potentially, but the change in feel on the floor. Now, are you saying like companies such as like RowEQ, that there's only a few ecosystem like companies that really build to fulfill need within that AMR space right now?
Yeah, and I still think that there's a lot more invention and innovation and kind of outside the box thinking that can go in there. I think there are folks like ROEC and RowEQ, whatever, however you want to say it, and all these different kind of top module providers, but they're not necessarily, they're thinking about how to attach carts and conveyors and things like that, but they're not reinventing what you can do with a mobile robot. We've started to see some of that with some top modules that can do things like disinfection via UV, which actually, I don't know that it's a autonomous mobile robot, but I know Fenway Park had made some investments in a few of these kind of UV towers that I think they're moving them around manually, but we're seeing the same thing being done in environments. And it's not just, I don't think the applications are just COVID related. And so when, COVID is more or less behind us, those applications will go away. I think there's a lot of cases where area disinfection is necessary in a lab environment, things like that. And so can that open up new doors for things like mobile robots to do a specific task? But that's the kind of innovation that I think we need to see more of, which is let's put something on this mobile robot that's going to make it be able to do a real specific function that someone can envision it doing for them.
Yeah, it's an interesting problem if you look at it. There's so many mobile robots out there. Cobots were a little different because UR was kind of one of the only names in the game for a while, at least, and the ecosystem had a chance to grow around a single platform being UR. It's almost the exact opposite nowadays with mobile robots. There's so many available, and a provider of those would have to try and accommodate for a lot of different to be able to represent a big part of the market. So it's a interesting problem, not easy one to solve for sure.
Yeah, and I think that part of the future is the convergence of some of these things. I think it's, I think we've seen more and more customers using mobile manipulators, mobile manipulators, or mobots, or whatever you want to call them, where you've
That's
got
a new
these.
one. I haven't heard that one before. Mobots.
Yeah, where you've got a mobile platform and a collaborative robot on top. And I think, as I said before, I think sensing is to your point. I think, Chris, you made this point, or Zach, I forget which of you said that that AI can do these things today, but they don't have enough data. There's not enough information being provided, and so the proliferation of sensing into the devices themselves for things like preventative maintenance, for things like intelligent predictive maintenance, I mean, as well. So preventative and predictive maintenance, but also for sensing maybe inconsistencies with a process. The more sensors that you have, the more that you can take that data and process it and figure out what really is going on around you. Kind of like as a human, we have intuition about what's going on around us. And that often is because at a certain frequency, we're picking up a sound, or out of the periphery of our vision, we've caught something that our conscious brain hasn't processed, but our subconscious brain has processed that information. And so if we can do that same kind of thing with robotics, I think that, manufacturers, certainly things like downtime and quality defects and keeping these things up and running. And I think I'm going on a bit of a weaving path. So if you'll stick with me for a second.
Like it.
The other thing that will make robotic applications more flexible is that ability to perceive the environment better, to be adaptable to changes. Is the part where you expected it to be? Well, if you can correct for that without a lot of human intervention or human special programming, now the robot is dramatically more valuable because it's going to keep running. It doesn't have to be a perfect environment for it.
Definitely. That's an very interesting commentary around what it will have to look like.
Ryan, do you have any questions for us?
Yeah.
You don't have to. It's okay if you don't.
Just tossed it out there as a.
Well, I'm curious to know what either of you think is the future here, because it's something I think about quite a lot in terms of what are these next areas for opportunity in manufacturing, in up and coming technologies. Anything that either of you are seeing that's maybe just outside of the cobot world that.
I'll go first.
Go ahead.
If I was talking to Aunt Betty once again, I would just talk about this. This is such a mature piece of technology. There's so much sensing, so much connectivity, so much data involved in it. It's so polished. And I feel like all of industrial automation is just living 20 years behind sometimes, at least. And this is 2021. And to most people, they're used to this level of technology. And if we had this level of technology in our factories working for us every day, I think it would be a much different world, and all of manufacturing would be much different. So there's a lot that goes into that. I don't know how Apple designed that product to be at the level that it's at in the entire industry. It pulled along with it. But, if we can get more of the B2B industrial automation, old school way of thinking, if we can bring that into the modern way and start to think of manufacturers and businesses that we sell to more as consumers, direct consumers, I think that's, kind of the next big thing. It's my hot take.
Yeah. And I completely agree. I think it goes back to that user experience piece, right? It's who can't pick up a iPhone and at least get dangerously far along in terms of, using it, and it becomes intuitive, that's how it's designed. And so
a 3-year-old can.
Yeah. It just comes naturally. Everyone from your 3-year-old to a 93-year-old can pick it up and FaceTime with their grand or great grandchildren. It is universally intuitive, and that's, I think UR has taken a good leap in that direction. But to your point, there still is there's a big jump still to go
Yeah.
to get to that level of use.
Zach?
I think a couple of things. I'd say connectivity is really important for the future. When I look at, say, like what High Robotics is able to do, and they know, I think Rob on the podcast said he knows that his customer is down before his customer knows that they're down. And I know that there are some hesitations of, well, some manufacturers allow for them to be connected to the internet, but obviously it's possible. And if we can get past that hurdle, I really believe that everything being connected at the end of the day and being able to be seen from anywhere in the world with the proper security measures, of course, only enhances what we can do from a manufacturing standpoint. I think there's probably 100 different ideas or companies that could be, within what I'm saying there. But I think that really allows for a lot. And a good example of that is even from a teleoperations standpoint, if you're working in another country or across the globe, being able to work on the floor and being able to connect an expert in, let's say you're really great at understanding powdered metal, and there's only a few sections of the globe that are really well versed in powdered metal. I mean, it's not that common, it's not that prevalent. And being able to connect somebody that is an expert in powdered metal operations and something specific about a machine there or a robot or whatever to somebody in another part of the globe that is having a similar or having a problem that is specific to that, you can connect people a lot faster if they were to at least see what's going on. I'm not saying I think that the whole teleoperations of being able to actually manipulate something on site is really cool and could be dynamic, but just being able to see what's going on and provide advice and that connection could be very powerful. And then on top of that, I can only think of being able to support customers easier from my standpoint today. If something happens, to be able to talk with them virtually and not have to necessarily fly there, not because we don't want to, but obviously it takes a long time often to just get somebody right there, and you could be on in minutes when there's a challenge if it was fully connected. So
yeah. And Zach, those problems are ubiquitous across almost every type of device in the industry. Like it's not just limited to robots even. I mean, you see.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that was definitely like a part of it. That's why I was kind of like, there's like 100 different needs. It's not really just robotics. It's kind of everything. I mean, all the machines on the floor, they're not connected really either. Some of them might be connected on the intranet right now, but for the most part, most companies are not running with full connection to, the internet. So
Even then, yeah, there's a big lag in terms of getting legacy equipment, getting data out of these things, getting sensors into them so that they can understand what's going on with their machinery.
Yeah.
And so they can use
part of
that
what
data.
humans do. Humans on the manufacturing floor communicate with each other, and they communicate about the machines that they're working with as well. And if there's going to be less humans on the manufacturing floor because of more automation, then you need the machines to talk to themselves more.
Yeah.
I have one other question.
Yeah.
If you want to go for it. And I'll pose it to either of you, but if from your professional experience, in terms of the career path that you chose, the things, the problems you've had to solve, if you could create a new course on a university curriculum that you could have taken that you think would have better informed you or could inform the next generation, either going down your career path or an area that you think that there's opportunities for, what would you put to that curriculum? What course?
Zach, you want to take this, or I have an answer, but if you have one, I'll let you go.
I think you're trying to pass it off, so I don't have any time to think here.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it in a two-part answer. So the most important and formative class I took was probably like the last term of senior year. I had taken programming classes up to that point, but I took an intro to Python course. And I think for the work that I've done as an engineer in my career, and also the work I do now as a businessman, or, like in management, whatever, a rote basic understanding of like the very basic principles of programming has helped immensely. And it was a travesty that I had to wait till my senior year on an elective course to maybe get that exposure, and there's too many people that never had that. Actually, I met my girlfriend of 7 years in that course too, so that helped out as well. But the other thing is, I think that they're much getting back to the same theory and practice thing that WPI always talks about. As far as robotics goes, there's not a lot of practice and there's a lot of theory. And I think a lot of the robotics study out there is around how to build robots, how to tune a PID loop, how to understand kinematics, things like that. But the real practical side of robots, you don't need as many theorists. You need more like developers or like implementers of robots. So I kind of think of it as the way that computer science has gone, where computer science in the beginning was very much a science. But now the majority of people you see writing code are developers, and their job is to develop mobile apps or something like that. If we can bring the curriculum around robotics up, like obviously still having that base in theory, but if we can bring it to the more mainstream, the way that we have 10,000 mobile developers within 20 miles of Boston for iOS applications, if we can do the same thing for robotics, then robots will really start to become as ubiquitous as they should be. So that's what I think, at least for the curriculum.
Good. Yeah, I think that's a really interesting thing from a robotics standpoint, Chris, that I think is very valuable.
It's almost an applied versus theoretical,
Yeah.
Definitely.
Great question.
So I would go down if we're talking about business and sales, it also has a lot to do with engineering and understanding the technical capabilities. And I think that there's this massive market of business plus sales plus marketing and then engineering and understanding technical capabilities that I think that there's very few, if any, universities that will, teach a course kind of combining it. Because I think that there are a lot of business people that can be very successful, but I think within robotics, to be very successful, I think you have to have both of it. And I think that you need to have this area of understanding how the engineering works to look at an application and provide a solution, especially from an automation solution standpoint. And then when you add in like industrial engineering on the manufacturing floor, I mean, it's virtually impossible to become an automation engineer in a university today. So I think that a lot of that has to do with, and it might be only dated to a certain sliver of time based on like what technology is actually out on the field and being used in the manufacturing, and where to essentially bridge the gaps. In a lot of cases, like we bridge the gaps from what the machine is doing and what the manual piece is doing now. I mean, we're often plugged a plug-in, right? After the fact to solve a specific solution. So, maybe in 20 years, it'll look a lot different and you'll see lines of 100 collaborative robots. And that might be a different mindset than saying, here's a machine, here's some manual pieces, and we're going to put this robot in between it. So for me, it would be a program probably out of the industrial engineering area, looking at like lean manufacturing and tying in some of the things that like Sam Bouchard pulls in from a lean robotics standpoint, and adding in automation, and then, adding in the business mindset, which you can look at from a sales side, but you also have to look at from like a lean robotics, if you when you read that book and talking about justification. And so, I mean, if I could build a curriculum, I mean, I'm coming to this answer after probably 120 seconds of talking, but I'd probably just build one around lean robotics.
There you go. Come into your local robotics program, sign on up.
Sponsored by Ryan Weaver.
What about you?
Both good answers. Both good answers.
I think you should start a podcast, Ryan.
Oh, I don't know. I think
We'll just so here's the other thing, because I really wanted to get into like marketing and some other really interesting things, which are different. You know, they might not necessarily lend itself to an end customer as much, but there are some really cool things that you do from how many different hats that you wear. So I mean this as we'd have to get you on as a regular, because there's so many other questions that I have here that I want to ask. We're definitely running pretty long here now, so we should probably end it. But I think we should save some of the business side and marketing standpoint, and even like training and getting into how to deploy your first robot and the different steps you should take. I think that could be very interesting next time around.
Yeah, for sure. This has been a
Part
great
2.
time. So just say the word. I'll be
Cool.
Sounds good.
I'll be back.
Thanks, Ryan.
I like that. We're definitely gonna have to have a part 2.
Sounds good, like a plan.
Great. Well, thanks for spending the time with us today. We really do appreciate it. And we hope that our listeners really love it as much as we do, and that they reach out to you and inundate you with so many questions that
opportunities
you can't.
And I'll be looking for the invite for the 1,000th robot party.
There you go.
1,000th robot coming to you 2021.
Well, that's what we're here for. So certainly, if anybody has an automation challenge they need to solve, accessany.com. That's where you should go. We'll certainly, if you're in the 6 New England states or even beyond these days. So
Cool.
Let us know.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.
Great.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Thanks.